Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Welcome back to Invest Africa. Now, still with me on the desk to unpack this week's topic, the state of manufacturing, is Coenraad Bezuidenhout, Executive Director at Manufacturing Circle, and Andrew Marshall, CEO of Nampak. Now, gentlemen, we can't talk about manufacturing without bringing in the labour discussion. I gave some stats in the first half about the number of employees in companies and in territories. Productivity is not necessarily aligned to the number of employees that you have. Sometimes it is the quality, and that we've seen the research studies between the correlation between productivity and the skills on the ground. In South Africa specifically, we sit with a low skills base, large skills shortages. Is this the same on the rest of the continent? How is this impeding our potential to become competitive in the manufacturing market?
Well, I think once again Andrew would be able to provide a much better specific perspective, but I think generally we can say that obviously education is a concern. Numerous of the economies' exposure to technology and to production processes and so on. There is also obviously, in just like in South Africa and numerous other African economies, a huge spatial legacy, development legacy that is not conducive to developing clusters, economies of scale, and those kind of things that need to be overcome. Things like transport infrastructure and the general social support network, the welfare net that are enjoyed by labour in more developed economies and in other areas of the world that simply do not exist. So there exists quite a bit of work to do. What we do find in other countries in Africa, and that we don't find in South Africa, is the labour forces that are not as organised, and organised labour that is
unionized, you mean?
Organised labour that is not as politicised, which is a great a magnet for manufacturing investors in the rest of the continent.
Now, Andrew, before we get to the union discussion, let's talk about the skills gap. In South Africa, we've identified it. Give us a mirror image of your skills base here versus territories like, let's say, Angola.
Yeah, I think we operate in the UK as well. We have a big manufacturing base there. We do half the milk bottles in the UK, 2 billion milk bottles a year. So we've got quite a diverse manufacturing base there. And there's no doubt the skills level there are at the highest. South Africa would be next, and our African operations would be below that. I think to answer your question about how do we staff up over there, what we do is we put expats in place initially.
I wanted to ask that, the skills transfer process.
Yeah, so what we do is we agree, in fact, with the governments when we set up there that we'll bring in a certain number of expats that typically will come from our other operations in South Africa, the UK, but they will go in for a period of time, and during that time they are expected to train up the local staff, and we gradually, in fact, upskill the local staff. Just to corroborate what Coenraad was saying there, I can't recall in the last 5 years a single strike in any of our African operations.
Outside of South Africa.
So clearly in South Africa I wouldn't be able to make that same statement. And so labour, we have peace, we don't have issues there. And we have an incredibly keen and enthusiastic workforce because they haven't had these opportunities before. They're desperate to learn. And we've had massive transfers of skills and now have locals in very senior positions in all our operations. So that process, I think, is happening not only ourselves, all the other operations that are, whether it's SAB, for example, who are big throughout Africa, or other South African companies like that we've mentioned, Tiger Brands, but it's also the multinationals operate on the same basis. So you're seeing this huge upskilling of skills that's taking place behind a very peaceful labour environment. So it's quite conducive to manufacturing as a result.
Coenraad, we don't have that peaceful environment in South Africa though. I mean, we're very protective, we're very unionised, politicised as you stated it, a lot of protectionism, but a lot of unhappy workers. And I mean, we regularly talk about strike seasons. Surely if you're an investor, if you're a business owner, is this not a deterrent if you want to bring your money anywhere into the continent? There's a peaceful environment just over the border versus what's going on in South Africa.
Look, the three of us that sit here don't need to convince one another, and we probably also don't need to convince the audience, so let's rather unpack the dynamic. I think what's important to remember about South Africa is that there's no problem in principle with unionization, but the degree to which our unions, our organized labor leadership is politicized do create huge difficulties, and it's to a large extent very much responsible for the way that the vicious cycle works here every bargaining season in South Africa. And so you'll see, very important to manufacturing, that it hits our upstream sectors first, mining, agriculture, and if they get hit, we suffer as a result, because we get supplied by them, we also supply to them, and there's an immediate knock-on effect. Of course, if those strikes are particularly protracted and become violent, normally next transport and the metal sector also get hit. Yeah. Now you may get flare-ups in other African economies, but there are very few examples where we know, it's like an alarm that goes off every time, and we know that this is what to expect. And of course, if it's an election year, or the ruling party is going to have elections in the coming year, then we know that those particular seasons are going to be particularly fraught. And if that is the situation, then we know that there is a dynamic that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed quickly, because relative to other African economies, we are starting to lose our shine as a result.
But my question is, why are they getting it right and why are we still stuck? Because you talk about a sensitive political environment. I mean, we have the Kenyan elections every few years, and we know the prior week to it and the week after could be fraught with danger on the streets and strikes and political violence.
Look, I think to a degree one must also say that South Africa is a bit of a victim of its own success. We've developed beyond the level that many of our African counterparts have, and we are confronted with the problems that they have still yet to encounter. We have the biggest economy. That's a problem they wish they had. They grow quicker than us. That's a problem we wish we
Absolutely.
had. So I think there are trade-offs to going into the different markets. But if we don't want to be regarded in South Africa as a sick man of the continent, much as Britain was in the 70s in relation to the rest of Europe, then we need to grasp the nettle when it comes to the labour situation.
We need to get our act together.
And that we must say require political leadership.
And political will and action to will.
Yeah.
Andrew, this is actually something that Coenraad brought up, but I'm going to pose it to you. Let's talk about public holidays and how that affects labour. I mean, Coenraad actually said China, 4 public holidays. The average African country, and I quickly looked at SADC, has an average of between 11 and 12. What does that do to productivity?
Yeah, I think when we look at markets, because I can only give it from our perspective, is that we're really looking at a whole host of factors. Clearly labour is one of them, and it makes it very attractive. There are other factors like the infrastructure, which are less attractive and where South Africa is better. But clearly where you've got opportunities is where you're going to invest. Now in South Africa, just to corroborate what was said earlier, the market is flat. So manufacturers actually here have spare capacity. We don't need to invest because we've got the equipment in place to supply the market. In Africa, take Angola as an example, we've run out of capacity. So we're going to invest there. Despite the infrastructure, despite the lack of roads and all that, which are coming, but despite that, we'll still invest. So I think at the end of the day, for business, it's really where the opportunities lies, the key driving force. You're not going to, in any one country, get everything you want, and you have to then plan around it. So if there's no electricity, you put in your own generators. We put in our own water supplies. We drill our own borehole. We purify the water for our management who live there, etc., etc. So you can plan around it. It's more costly as a result, but you do know you'll have labour peace.
Labour does offer opportunity, though. We've seen factory wages rise in China and other parts of Asia, with some multinational companies perhaps considering moving their production plants from there to here. How do you create opportunity out of that?
Look, there are lots of different dynamics that are causing localization of manufacturing to become a more attractive option globally. But in South Africa, what counts against us is both, wages that have increased and productivity that has not kept the pace, and in addition to that, high administered prices. That's energy in particular, relative to other economies where energy prices have actually fallen. the use of exploitation of shale gas resources in America has seen huge amounts of manufacturing move back that way. There's also been technological advances like 3D printers, which makes manufacturing on a small scale cost competitive again for many of the more advanced products that they manufacture. And those are all of the things that we should be very conscious of. But in South Africa and in Africa in general, how we finance, fund, roll out infrastructure, the pace at which we do it, and the efficiency with which we recoup the costs invested in that infrastructure is something that we should look very carefully at, because in South Africa in particular, it's cost us a huge amount of efficiency and competitiveness in relation to other manufacturing destinations.